1 week after the father of the late Jordan River Anderson spoke out, Jordan's principal continues to be in the news for the services not being funded or for the questionable services it is funding. Our Truth in Politics panel is here now to discuss. Jennifer Laewetz is CEO of Paskwâw Harbour Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer, Niigaan, thanks for being with us as always. Niigaan, we'll start with you, and the Fed saying more than $8 billion in funding has been announced for Jordan's principal since 2016. Yet there's still a huge backlog of unprocessed claims. Money has been spent on things like office supplies, computers, sports equipment, headshots for fashion modeling. Is all of this in keeping with the intent of Jordan's principal?
Before we came on, or just recently when I was writing my own pieces on this controversy involving Jordan's principal, I went back and I looked at the federal government website on the definition on what is the criteria for funding under Jordan's principal. And according to the federal government website, it says that to ensure that all First Nations children can access the products, services, and supports they need when they need them, despite where they live and what circumstances they live in. Funding can help with a wide range of health, social, and educational needs, and it kind of lists off a few different things that might be some unique needs. The spirit of Jordan's principle was built predominantly on emergent cases. And if we think back to Jordan Anderson, it was about the fact that he needed urgent, long-term care, health care in order simply to survive. What that has now become is a catch-all for what has been an emergent situation that First Nations children find themselves in after a long period of chronic neglect, of mistreatment, underfunding of communities, which then there's, if you're to say to yourself, what are the reasons that children go into the child welfare system or that suffer or die? There are thousands of reasons. And so Jordan's principle has become this catch-all. It is a very complicated situation, and $8 billion is just the tip of the iceberg to try to begin to just bring First Nations children to the same standard of living that every single Canadian enjoys and has privileges and access to.
Jennifer, Jordan River Anderson's father, Ernest, recently spoke out and criticized First Nations leaders over the way Jordan's principle is being used or abused. What do you make of what he had to say?
I think that I'm actually on his side on this, and it's been a really weird few weeks talking about the conversation around Jordan's principle and the backlog, because initially I had entered this space being a little bit upset with government, but then once I heard Jordan River Anderson's dad speak out about it, it kind of opened my eyes that perhaps the wide scope of what is eligible under Jordan's principle has created a lot of uncertainty and perhaps mismanagement. But is it mismanagement if nations and the people managing Jordan's principle didn't know any better? But it's also, what I've noticed is taking a little bit of the accountability off of the province as well. Like province of Saskatchewan, we're seeing today that the Saskatoon school division they're cutting a bunch of EAs because they were leaning quite heavily on Jordan's principle funding. So it's like, well, if the provinces aren't funding education like they should be, then they're leaning on other areas, and it's creating this backlog and this mess. Applications are up 900%. How is the federal government even supposed to address that? And now they're sifting through tons and tons of different applications that, may be urgent, some might not be urgent. And unfortunately, the only people who fall through the cracks are the ones who need it the most. And that's really, really concerning.
Right. Niigaan, that same day that Jordan's father spoke, a chief here in Manitoba criticized the federal government and also said that chiefs and councils were being made out to be bandits on social media. Is the blame on leadership misplaced?
Yeah, I'll just slightly, not perhaps disagree, but just slightly point out that I don't know if it's that chiefs don't know any better. It's that chiefs have an overwhelming series of demands in order to be able to service those communities. Certainly those young people in those communities are dealing with suicide epidemics, are dealing with even just not having a youth center, or access to basic services like computers, internet, being able to have the same kind of sport programs, the same kind of mental health. I mean, imagine just if the lack of nursing stations are on First Nations, imagine the lack of mental health workers. And Jennifer's absolutely right. This is something that the provinces have woefully been absent on, and have simply just put up their hands and say, well, those First Nations are federal responsibilities, so oh well, and then throw up their hands and say, cry out foul, when those same young people end up in provincial healthcare systems in cities. And that's when we get into the situation of Jordan Anderson, where the provincial governments say, well, the federal government should be paying for this and so on. This is not an issue of chief mismanagement. It is not an issue of chiefs exploiting or First Nations organizations exploiting funds. This is an issue of overwhelming demands, a lack of commitment for just basic things like education. Like going back to Jennifer's example in Saskatchewan, if there's a need for 80 EAs to help First Nations kids who are in the provincial system to just become the same level as everyone else, and if Saskatchewan goes, oh, well, I guess we're not going to fund those. They have identified the problem. Well, deal with it. That's what your whole job is as an education system. And just putting up your hands and going, oh, well, those kids, I guess they're just not going to get the services now, is exactly the kind of mentality that led to the death of Jordan Anderson.
Jennifer, in testimony last spring, the Associate Deputy Minister of Indigenous Services Canada listed off some of the things that urgent requests were being made under Jordan's principle, things that we touched on there: modeling headshots, a zipline kit, glow sticks, expenses for pets. Are these the types of things you think that the program should be used for?
Well, and I think that's part of the problem, right, is those are not urgent requests. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to sit here and say that acquiring glow sticks and modeling headshots are urgent, because they're not. You know, I'm an Indigenous person with a disability, and, you know, my disability when diagnosed was quite significant. It's a neuro disease. And if you notice that little orange cup behind me, if you can't see the logo, it's from an Indigenous advocacy group called BC ANDS, where that's what they do, is they raise the awareness around Indigenous disability, because our barriers are so much more significant than non-Indigenous people, and even accessing help when things like Jordan's principle are tied up, and even other areas of healthcare where, you know, if you need counseling services or assessments or anything like that, and they're saying, well, that has to go through NIHB, that right there is a mess. And that could be why things are falling onto Jordan's principle, because anyone that's ever tried to use non-insured health benefits through their treaty status, trying to get glasses, you have to hope that those healthcare providers even offer direct billing, because a lot of people don't have that type of money just to put it up front. When I went through my assessments for my ADHD, it was thousands of dollars that I had to save to get assessed later in life, because through the ministry that gave my family no support when I got out of foster care, there was just never any money or extra funding available for my family to get me the help that I needed. And so now, even as adults, we're seeing what that's looking like in crime and addiction and mental health for people that never did get the services when they were younger, what that looks like now when they're adults. What's going to happen now to all these youth that are falling through the cracks in 10, 15 years from now? I do think we do have a collective responsibility as a people. I know it's in my teachings. We don't take more than we give. Try to be reasonable, you know, try to be fair. And I hope this serves as more of a wake-up call. Rather than pointing fingers, we come back to the table and say, okay, I agree. Let's try to measure on our nations what we actually deem as urgent and what might just be a want that could help you get to that top success level. But we need to be measuring it carefully so that kids with disabilities and health and urgent needs do not fall through the cracks.
So Niigaan, in a statement we received from Indigenous Services this week, they said over a 2-year period there was a 367% increase in the number of approved requests under Jordan's principle. We've heard chiefs speak publicly that the floodgates were opened and now the tap has been turned off. Nations are now out millions of dollars hoping to get that recouped. What's your take on all of that?
So this is exactly an issue of sovereignty. If you look to if the federal government said, okay, well, we're not going to define what is the funding that will be specific for Jordan's Principle, if we're going to make it a kind of a catch-all. And then you have this massive influx because, as we mentioned before, these are overwhelming needs that are First Nations children who, for decades upon decades, generations upon generations, they have been built up to be in situations involving that, yes, they're in mental health crisis. Yes, they're in basic crisis involving, access to simple principles or simple things that Canadians enjoy elsewhere. What ends up happening is that the federal government is then stuck trying to define what is and what is not part of the criteria. And I think we realize that through this conversation, the federal government is simply just accepting everything and going, well, we don't want to be the barometer of what will be keep a child out of the child welfare system or in a situation of suicide or et cetera. And so they just accept everything. If this was something in which they worked with First Nations, in which First Nations were making the decisions, we would be seeing closer to the principle of what Jennifer spoke about on the recorded section earlier, where we know what our needs are. We know what the pressing needs are. And particularly, it is local governments that understand where the money needs to be put first. And that would be where those emergent cases would be dealt with. So, for example, they're not going to look the same everywhere. In one community, it may be a youth center. In one community, it may be a land-based program. In another community, it may be healthcare services that involve mental health, whatever it might be. But this is an issue precisely in which the federal government simply just opened up the floodgates and now is blaming First Nations for having overwhelming demands that the federal government created.
Opening up the floodgates, yet Jennifer, we've done stories here not that long ago and hear stories I'm sure we all do all the time from families with legitimate health needs for their children that are being denied access or aren't getting the access to funding. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, it's really upsetting to hear that, and especially because some of these cases are life or death. And I think when we put needs on a scale, we have to be very, very careful in the fact where I know that I said earlier today that, things like glow sticks and stuff like that are not, an urgent need compared to somebody that might have, an urgent health need that's literally health or life or death. But at the same time, if you have a youth that's struggling really, really bad, right below my feet right now is my black lab. My dog is my mental health. He's a therapy dog. And to me, that's an urgent need. He goes with me everywhere I go. He's always at my feet. And to other people, they might think, well, that's not an urgent need. Why do you need that? Well, if you've ever dealt with any type of PTSD or any significant mental health issue, you know that mental health supports and the things that help you look different for everybody. And I saw in one of the reports, it was talking about, somebody was denied some type of service last year, and then it was referencing that there's like Xboxes and PlayStations and stuff like that going through the program. But I've been on nations where, yes, there are PlayStations in the youth center, but what the public doesn't see is that youth center serves as a safe place after school for the children that need structure in their life. And not only that, those spaces sometimes double as emergency shelters for kids on the weekends or evenings when they need that safe place to go. And the goal is to make it as normal and feel as, casual as possible, because you don't want to put them in a room with, white walls and white flooring that's a social services office. You want them to feel normal. And sometimes things like PlayStations and Xboxes that can help them connect to other kids is quite literally that. So it's tough to see when the nuance doesn't exist because the public gets that side. But if they've never been on a nation to actually see what that looks like, it's hard for them to understand that it's not as black and white as it seems.
I guess when it comes to the public side, Niigaan, if Indigenous Services is approving roughly, say, about $1 billion a year since the program's been in place, do you see that continuing?
Well, unfortunately, I think we are seeing in the Liberal leadership campaign, also in the potential future possible Conservative leadership of this country, if this election goes the way the polling is suggested, there will be less interest, much less engagement, and perhaps a real move away from social programs towards economic issues. We know that the focus on the election campaign federally, but also the leadership campaign have almost exclusively been on economic issues. We know that when economic issues are in the forefront, when they are the central issue, that's social issues, and that means Indigenous issues, issues of emergent reality, life and death situations. We know that those are left behind. We know that consultation is most often ignored to the sake of a national economic agenda, and Indigenous peoples are often painted as the enemies of that. We know that there may be challenges coming forward in the future involving Jordan Anderson or Jordan's principal funding, but the fact is we do not want more Jordan Andersons. We do not want more situations where First Nations kids are in emergent care or in emergency situations, or are in situations in which they are leading towards lives that then therefore enter into the provincial healthcare system, child welfare system, justice system. I think Canadians need to understand this is not a First Nations issue. This is an issue that every single Canadian should be focused upon, and we need to continue the kind of progressive steps that we've taken in only the past decade to be able to just deal with the beginning phases of the first generation of First Nations kids that we have said matter. We have only recently said that, put on our orange shirts, and we can't simply just go, well, I guess we're done with that and check the box and move on and then try to start building an economy. This will be a persistent issue that all Canadians need to be focusing upon, because the First Nations kids, we know that First Nations young people, fastest growing segment of the community, of the country.
Jennifer, we had the story this week, 90 EAs or so, educational assistants, Saskatoon Public Schools, that won't be rehired. There was about 90 or more in Manitoba this past fall as well. Those are ones that we're just hearing about. The AMC had a sign up before Christmas, I guess, saying Jordan's principal, no more funds available. Are we starting to see the funding slow down and a crackdown on what might be getting approved?
I think so. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more heavy stipulations when it comes to this sort of thing. I think there's a real conversation that needs to happen between the provinces and the federal government, where it shouldn't be this difficult to come to the table and decide what's what. But the public school division saying, well, we can't fund them anymore, we're out. And the province has essentially been taking the back seat since those EAs were funded by Jordan's principal. But that's not an excuse to let the province off the hook either. These are still kids that exist in Saskatchewan. They're still kids that exist in these school systems, and they need that help. As a child that suffered significantly through school, I hated school for that reason. It really upsets me to see that there's going to be a ton of kids that are not getting the help they need. And what does that also do to our graduate rates as well? Because Saskatchewan School Division talks about having these special programs to make sure that they're seeing the grad rates increase for Indigenous students. But what do you think is going to happen if you pull their supports when they're in, grade 2, 3, 4, 5? It's not going to be good. And I'm really, really concerned about what this looks like, especially in the future, because again, kids turn into adults, and if you take care of the child, you take care of the adult. And I think what Niigaan had said about, we really had this conversation for the last little bit. Now is not the time to stop having that conversation. It shouldn't matter who's in government. Every single one of them has a responsibility to make sure they're coming to the table and making sure the kids that forever have been not as equal in society are looked after.
Jennifer, Niigaan, we'll leave it there for the podcast this week. Thanks to you both for taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, be much. Thanks.